Hey everybody, my name is Mark Wolf. I discovered the grand unified theory of game design. The basic primer is in the description below, and in this video we're going to be covering a real game needs to give its players full customization of strategy. In this video we're going to be covering what that is, why it is, how to do it, and what it looks like. But this is probably, I think, the most difficult topic to understand. And the reason is because almost every design problem here requires a unique solution specific to each game. So we're going to try and break things down and make it as easy as possible. So to start, what is full customization of strategy? Well, we know that a competition is players utilizing limited resources to achieve conflicting goals. Or I guess you can maybe just have one goal, but the way that they utilize these resources is that player's strategy. And when you have full customization of that, it means you have full control, not just over which resources you choose, but maybe also the modulation, how much of them, how much you rely on certain resources. And we'll talk more about how to think about that here in a second, but we're going to get to why that is. So, why do players need full customization of strategy? Well, because as I've talked about in previous videos, and I think specifically in the player agency video, if you remove player agency, here being applied to full customization of strategy, then the skill alone of the competitors does not determine victory. It undermines the competition to not have full customization of strategy because you're removing player agency. If you're removing player agency, then necessarily you are making the determination of victory some other way that is not exclusively the skill and action of the players. So when I say that a real game must give its players full customization of strategy, another way to understand this is that a game can never determine a player's strategy for them. And we've talked about this before, again, I think in the agency video and probably a few other videos, that logically speaking, when you predetermine the outcome, it makes the player's decisions meaningless. It makes the player's actions meaningless. It makes gameplay meaningless. That's what makes a not game. So how do you design full customization of strategy? How do we do that? Well, I think the metaphor that I came up with, the picture that I came up with was, think of it like you're giving a player a bowl and you're telling them there's a whole bunch of things here and you can put whatever things can fit in the bowl. And if there was a power difference they could achieve, then that would be making the bowl bigger. They could fit more things in it. And these things can be both things that the player controls directly on their character, or if you're in some tabletop games or in more abstract games, you could think of this more as the player's play field, whatever's in their direct control. But this also includes things in the environment. And full customization of strategy extends to all the limited resources that players can utilize. So when you're designing things in the environment, these are things that either anybody can use and they can use them differently, or things that are available to everyone for all strategies. All strategies are like taken account for. But then you could also maybe have, I don't know, just other different conditional things that don't funnel strategy or exclude strategy. That's a good way to think of it. So when I'm talking about the things the player is putting in the bowl, from a design standpoint, these are all the mechanics that you have that a player has at their disposal to compete. And they do need full control over these. Usually these are stats, but they don't have to be explicit stats. Or I guess what's the So they can be explicit or discrete. Discrete stats would be something like Link in the original Legend of Zelda, or I think maybe any of the Zelda games, because I don't know, just Twilight Princess might have stats, I can't remember, but I think most, if not all, of the Zelda games don't have stats, and the only modulation that you get is with items that might make you stronger or more durable or make you do more damage or something like that. But then you could also get explicit stats, whether it's Warhammer or World of Warcraft or Dungeons and Dragons or GURPS or Fallout. Take your pick. I guess so more examples of discrete stats would be something like Mega Man or Bomberman or a whole lot of side-scrolling beat 'em up games. And I think that's actually kind of a more elegant design. I kind of like that sometimes. I like that it makes it simpler for the player. That's a good way to think of it too. Is it's not that you're taking choices away from the player, it's that you're giving them different ways to access those things. So it's not that they're manipulating their stats, it's that the things that they're choosing are modulating their stats just by the choice. And so again, Zelda is a great example of this, where if you had maybe a limited items that you could put onto Link, and you had access to all of those items, but they gave you, a full customization of strategy instead of being like niche use items, then whatever items you chose could possibly modulate something like, speed or durability or damage, etc. Another important thing to point out is that in designing stats, when I was talking about like if you're giving them a modulation of power, you're giving them a bigger bowl. So you have stat totals, and this is determined when you're going over fair and balanced. And the other thing that you're determining is what the scope of each strategy can be. And this is where things get complicated. This is where everything gets unique for each specific game, because each game is going to be designed completely differently. It's going to have its own genre. It's going to be in its own medium. Answering how to design customization of strategy and create all the limited resources that players can choose from is very different when you're designing, a card game versus a first-person shooter, or an RPG, even in a tabletop RPG versus a video game RPG. Those two things are fairly different. So you want to start, no matter where you are, with covering your bases. So you've got your basic stats, and these are the metrics you've decided that you're going to quantify everything with. Now you want to figure out your interactions, and you're going to figure out how all those things are quantified. And everything is going to be in relation to the limits that you've set. You may have to modulate those, you may have to change those in design at some point. Maybe you set the power level too high, or maybe something else needs to be changed, or maybe the stat limits are fine, but the point total needs to be dropped, or whatever math you're working in is going to be specific to that context. So what you're also figuring out too is not just what interactions you want to have, but a lot of the emergent properties that you want to be possible in gameplay, because you want players to have full control over these things. So you're not pre-planning everything. You're not telling them what they need to do. You're giving them a competition, giving them giving them their resources, and telling them they need to make a strategy, which is a limiting choice from those resources. And they get to utilize those without having agency removed to compete and to try and achieve victory. And so here's where, you're going back to things like fair and balance and immersion. This is where you're exploring, immersive ideas in game mechanics, not just in appearance. This is where, in terms of fairness, you're making sure that no strategy is favored over another. There's no strategy that like doesn't have an answer, or that, like, if you're designing things with type damage and you've got one type that isn't affected by any of them, but also doesn't have any drawbacks, that might imbalance things. And it's because, every time you calculate things for that type, it's like missing a variable. So this is also, where a lot of your decisions are informed too, with more like how you're scaling things for players to be engaged. How are you making sure that this scales to varying player engagements? Is this a single player game? Does it have a point? And if it's a single player game, if it doesn't have a point, why not make it multiplayer? Why not give it a multiplayer component? Why not give it transferability? Why not give it expandability? Or, things that can be traded. Like, that is a very great thing about Pokemon is, and I feel like this is true for a lot of the game companies that made Game Boy games. I feel like enough of them didn't take advantage of the link cable. The link cable was one of the greatest components, and I think a lot of the designers too felt this way, that it was one of the greatest components of the Game Boy, the fact that you could transfer data between the two, or that you could use it to connect other things. And so few games made use of this. It's, even if it's not a game, even if there isn't, a whole lot of point to it, the fact that you could trade Pokemon between one another was something very cool. And if there was more to it, if there was more that you could do there, that would have a lot more use than if Pokemon was just a game that you couldn't interact with anyone else over. If it was just a your experience, you couldn't trade Pokemon, between versions. You couldn't catch all 150. You had to put in some secret code or something. I don't know. It would just be so much worse of a game. And there's a whole lot of other things, especially for like battling and, interaction. It's like, these are just missing design opportunities. If you made a single player game, but then made a single player game with a battle system where you're, raising Pokemon or raising Digimon or, Tamagotchi or whatever, and you weren't able to interact with other players, even though you'd set up that battle system, it would be nonsensical. It would be money on the table that you're leaving as a designer that could have made that much better. And once you know that these are all goals in design, you can go back to full customization of strategy and say, how can we facilitate this? What are the things we need to cover? We have our basic interactions. How does this play out? Is there a deficiency? What is the environment that this separate competition is happening in? Or is it a separate competition? How are they linked? And all of these things can inform your design here. It's not just, what kind of attacks we have. It can also be things like movement. It can be things like defenses. Like I said, here too, designing the terrain, coming back to immersion, all of these things are things that you're thinking about when you're figuring out what are all the different strategies players can choose from in this game. And sometimes if you're, in a very big game, that can be overwhelming. But, if you're going through these videos and you're, doing things step by step and you're making sure everything is theory compliant, you won't run into any of the bad pitfalls except, well, it's not a bad pitfall, but it's just, having to be creative. And I don't know if that's a pitfall. That's more an opportunity. I think that's a very good place to be. And especially if you know what to do with your ideas once you have them, then you can actually make use of them. And then that's really the important point. So Uh, Here is where we can now get into some examples. What exactly does this look like? Well, I think another great time to bring up GURPS is right here. This is probably one of my favorite examples, and maybe even the first and best example, is that GURPS gives you point totals, or gives the GM the ability to designate point totals for the campaign. So all the characters are built at that power level. And it gives you the whole rule book to design your character with. You have full control in character design. And those points can be spent on stats, advantages, which are like powers, disadvantages, skills, and skills include things like spells or other kinds of maybe psionic powers count as mental skills, things like that. And then there's another thing called quirks, and quirks don't have any mechanical significance except for like they give you some points back, like a discount, like disadvantages, but they just have a role playing value. And actually, you have full freedom over that. There's no rules for quirks; those are all completely just player made, which is cool. So, but in character creation in GURPS, you have full control over what you're spending those points on, and all the things you can spend those points on do cover the full range of strategies. They address all of the different stats, they address all of the different dynamics in combat, and all of the different mechanics that combat has available. And they make sure to incorporate skills into combat. They make sure that all of the spells that are combat oriented have interesting and unique mechanics and interesting dynamics, so that they're not all operating the same. And we'll talk more about this in a moment here when we talk about Mortal Kombat. So our next example is the Dragon Ball Z fighting games, and this is Dragon Ball Z Budokai 1 through 3. And the cool thing about these is, so it's a 3D fighting game, and I think kind of like Tekken, where you can move like you can sidestep. So the cool thing about the way this game works is you have full control over the character's ability loadout, like all the special attacks they can have in the match. You can customize those in like a character creation sort of thing, and you can give multiple attacks of the same one to make it more powerful. So you can even modulate the power of that. And that's one of the things I was talking about before, sort of like how Zelda does that. This is another way to do that, is each of the abilities that you give them, you can double up or triple up to make them double or 3 times as powerful. And there's a couple other interesting things about the way these work. So each character has like a set of abilities where all the characters have the same basic abilities, and they have ones that are unique. But the ones that are the same aren't all the same for every character. It's just that they all basically work the same, and they all have the same, like, I think, button controls. But I think some of them might be different mechanically, but they're all different cosmetically. So they all look unique, but they all have that same, function. Like this is everyone's Hadouken. So, and of course, it's Goku's Kamehameha. It's I think Vegeta's Gallic Gun. Et cetera, et cetera. So then you also have the other attacks. There's like back attacks that you can do, so the Kamehameha is like a forward energy attack. There's like for Vegeta, there'd be like, I think, a final flash that's a back energy attack. And then all the unique abilities have their own like button combinations. And you can also, double up and triple up on those. And then there's also utility things that you can give your character. So you can customize a whole lot about like this fighting game. And I don't know many other fighting games that let you do that. I think there's like a wrestling N64 game that lets you build your own custom wrestler. That's really cool. But this is a very, very good idea. And if you took it to its fullest, if you made this a real game, you'd of course want to eliminate twitch reflexes so you didn't turn it into a sport. But in addition to the abilities and like how much you rely on them and how powerful they are, you should also definitely be able to build your own character. You should also be able to modulate the stats of those characters. And by stats in a fighting game, what I'm talking about are things like, their reach or how high they can jump, um, their weight, things like that. And so I guess maybe it would, Super Smash Bros. Is a really good kind of platform of design. I think that has a lot of potential if they could do it right. Super Smash Bros. Has way too much twitch reflexes, but there's so much potential in there to get really simple stat customizations and stat loadouts and ability loadouts and attacks and like defenses and support things. And like you could build a whole game where there was a catalog, like it's a giant catalog that you could customize your own fighter with, and it would just be the greatest tournament fighter ever. I don't know why somebody hasn't done that yet. I mean, yes. So Mugen kind of like ventures into this territory a little bit, but Mugen works very, very differently. It's not so much, yeah, it's not quite the same thing. But moving on to our other examples here, I guess. So we've covered Pokemon and Final Fantasy before, but what I want to talk about here is not just the fact that it's like partial customization of strategy. Like, so Pokemon gives you control over what attacks they have, and you can choose which Pokemon you have, but they sort of self-level. There's no control over the stats. It's not really designed, like, you could make it so the stats were static and that leveling gave you something else, and that's something a lot of designers should consider in games like this. Is there's really no reason why the Pokemon leveling need to modulate their stats. I mean, they could, but that's something you should give players control over. So the fact that they don't really takes away a lot of strategy, a lot of customization. And I think Final Fantasy kind of does a lot of this too, while also at the same time then wasting a lot of players' time with just meaningless customization that is already solved. Like, all of the customization you're doing isn't so much customization as it is optimization. There's already a right answer to everything you're doing. It's just the game is manually making you input everything into each place. Like, there's already like a right answer for everything. There's already a right build for everything. There's already a most powerful item at each time. But coming back to Pokemon, the other thing too, I don't know if this is much like a problem, but so I've talked about this example before of a way to add modulation to the player in combat for their strategy. So it's not just how the Pokemon are built. And let's assume sort of an ideal Pokemon where all the abilities are fair and balanced and it really isn't solvable, so that, strategy is required to win. It's not just what players are choosing to do each move, but I feel like there's a bit of a missing potential where it's not just like what the player is telling the Pokemon to do. There's also an opportunity for the player to do something, because the Pokemon already is, gonna do something. You're already gonna like have it do something in that attack. But it would be so much better if, like I said before, there was something customizable about the player's strategy in the combat that they could add to it, so that each player's, or each in Pokemon, each trainer's strategy was unique. Each way they raised their Pokemon, each way they battled was unique. And when I say battle, I don't just mean like the attacks that they've given their Pokemon. Like, when you use items in Pokemon, it, I think, takes a move away from your Pokemon. So they don't get to attack if you use an item. And I think that's a very bad design. I think that's where I would put that in, is each turn the player could also do something extra. And that's like, there's so much design potential there. If anyone in Pokemon is listening, you should do that on your next game. So, wow, this video is getting too long. I don't think we're going to get to the Warhammer example. We might have to save that for later. Yeah, I think we will. But the last thing I guess I want to talk about then is the Mortal Kombat thing. Mortal Kombat thing. So, Mortal Kombat does something really cool. It demonstrates that you can still have things like elemental attacks without suffering from the design flaws of having type damage in a game where type damage doesn't work. And I've mentioned this before, type damage doesn't work in single character games. It works better in a game where you have a loadout strategy, especially something turn-based. That's much better. But you'll notice in Mortal Kombat, you can still, I mean, Sub-Zero has a freezing attack, which violates player agency. I don't like that. It's a bad design that Sub-Zero's attack freezes the other character, because then they just can't do anything. You stop playing the game for a second. It's a bad design. But the fact that it works on everybody is a very good design. That's different from Pokemon, where type is considered. But the reason that I bring this up is because it's one of the more interesting topics of this design space of customization of strategy, is that it manages to have these sort of, elemental things like freezing or fire or reptile spitting acid. But instead of having a type damage effect, it has a mechanical effect. And these mechanics can be very simple. It's not like they have to be complicated. There's, the difference between like Sub-Zero's freeze, which shoots midair, versus I think Cabal's, I forget what the attack is. Maybe it's like a saw blade or something. And he basically summons it out of nowhere and it just runs across the bottom of the screen. And the mechanical difference between those two attacks, well, aside from a speed difference, there might be a speed difference, but aside from a speed difference, which let's assume it's equalized, is just the placement, the shot placement. One attack is mid, one attack is ground level. It's really as simple as that. That's all the mechanic is where the shot goes. The controls can be exactly the same. But the characters look different. The attacks look different. And just that one simple mechanical difference means they work different. It's a different strategy. Now it forces, in order to respond, the opponent, well, I don't know if it forces them, but in order to respond, it changes what the opponent has to do. It limits one of their options. If you're fighting against Cabal and he throws that attack at you, you probably want to jump in the air or you're going to get hit. And from there, Cabal, or the character playing Cabal, could then do other things now that you've got your opponent in the air. And that is that is a limited resource that is part of their strategy. And this is a very, very good design. I really like how Mortal Kombat does that. Twitch reflexes aside, being a sport aside, that's something a lot of games can learn from, because a lot of designers try to implement type damage, try to implement protection and all those things. But they should just make those things cosmetic and then focus on making them fun mechanics. Last thing here I wanted to go over was more an example of environmental customization of strategy, because I wanted to make sure I provided a little bit more of that. And also, since we're not going to get into Warhammer, so I'm just going to read this here because I wrote it up. So, like the Dark Knight example from Ocarina of Time, let's say you're fighting in a room with large pillars, Any competitor can get knocked into a pillar for damage, but you also use them for cover. Maybe 2 spells could bounce off one before ending at their next impact, or maybe even each pillar provides some additional combat resource like exploding stone grenades. This one simple room feature doesn't change any character's build or strategy, nor does it take strategy away, but rather it gives all strategies used in the competition additional resources they can mutually utilize in different ways to make this competition more dynamic than having a straightforward terrain variation. Also, in designing something like exploding stone grenades in that room, which any character could use, I would not make them limited in number, but rather limit the number a character can carry at once. For example, 1. This means no matter how long the battle goes on for, no one ever runs out of grenades. They're always accessible in a strategically interesting way, and since each character can only carry 1 at a time, it doesn't imbalance the competition or make it unfair, all things being equal. You could easily make the explosions too big and create random victory, and that would be something that would need fixing. So that's it for this very long video. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. I have a bunch of new subscribers. Wow, I am very, 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 very thankful, and I'm hoping that you guys are enjoying these. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments. If you have any thoughts, critiques, anything, please, sound critiques. There are some odd comments out there, but thank you, and see you in the next one.